Oh my god, 2 trombones in one video? That's right, we're getting weird with it. So today I'm going to tell you the differences between a tenor trombone and a bass trombone. Why do we have both? What's the reason for both? What jobs do they roll? Whatever. So the bass trombone is the bass instrument in the trombone family. Duh. Bass trombones tend to have larger bores. For example, if I take the mouthpiece out of my bass trombone, I can't put it in my tenor trombone. And if I take the mouthpiece from my tenor trombone, I can't put it in my bass trombone. Though there are tenor trombones out there that do have a similar bore size to bass trombones and you can interchange the mouthpiece, the 2 examples I have here do not have that ability. You can also see, if you look at the bells for these 2 horns, the bass trombone is a little bit more conical, meaning that the bore in the tubing grows faster than on the tenor trombone, and the bells are also much bigger on the bass trombone. The slide sections, if I can stack these 2, on bass trombones also tend to be further apart than their tenor counterparts, as you can see here. You may hear a lot of people say, oh, 2 triggers means bass trombone, 1 trigger or no trigger means tenor trombones. Usually that is the case, but that's not technically true, since there are bass trombones that only have 1 trigger and the trigger is just in a different key, or the bell is just bigger and they're meant to be bass trombones. Generally, as you get more into professional musicianship, the cosmetic differences between a bass trombone and a tenor trombone tend to blur. The only consistency really is the bell size. Tenor trombones tend to stop around 9 inches, whereas bass trombones can go up to 11 inches. But otherwise, they really start to blur, and you don't really see a clear line that says this is where it becomes a bass trombone, this is where it becomes a tenor trombone. So now let's get into why we use bass trombones and tenor trombones and what makes them different. The trombone falls into the low brass family along with the baritone, euphonium, and tuba. Trombones are designed to fill the tenor voice role, typically playing higher pitches than baritones, euphoniums, and tubas, although euphoniums are kind of all over the place just because of how they are, but generally trombones are higher up than their other low brass counterparts. If trombones are designed to play in the more tenor voice, why would we make a bass trombone? The short answer is general stylization in music and how you want parts to be laid out. Even as recently as a few centuries ago, brass instruments didn't exist. They're a very modern addition into the music world, not as modern as like the accordion or the what's that horror movie instrument that's like the very first brass instruments were natural horns. These are things like trumpets and like not like modern day trumpets that have like the valves and do the rap, but the old style trumpets where it's just like a tube. Think like the Renaissance paintings and stuff where it's literally just a tube with a bell in a hole. And also the natural horn, which is like a French horn but without valves because it came first. Since we didn't have valves, you were restricted to what we call the harmonic series. Since those were the only notes you could play, music was very restrictive, so brass instruments weren't really ever needed. They were cool for military things, but like, in general, not very musical instruments. And then they thought, hey, what if we could change the pitch? And that's why most natural horns have like 37 different crooks that you need to use. And then they got the smart idea of taking a tube and putting it on the outside of another tube to make the slide. Ooh. This allowed you to have various positions and change the pitch of the horn on the fly. Assuming you don't do that, this gave you various pitches and allowed you to change the pitch of the horn on the fly rather than having to stop, pull out all your slides, put them back in, and then continue playing. The key signature thing nowadays that makes a trombone is the slide section. These horns with slides were not called trombones, they were called sackbuts. A sackbut is just that Renaissance trumpet that I told you about earlier, but you smack a slide on it basically. They were a lot stuffier, they were not as big and boomy as we think of a modern trombone being, but they eventually developed into the modern trombone and you don't see very many sackbuts anymore. However, there was still a problem. Now we were no longer just restricted by playing one harmonic series, as we now had an entire variable amount. There were still notes we could not reach. For an example, If I start on B flat and go down, around E natural, I run out of notes to play before I have to drop and start playing the pedals. Since that gap is there, this horn does not cover every possible note it could play, same with the old version of the sackbut, though you can kind of force them, but it's not good. To resolve this problem, musicians created the bass trombone. Except not this one. They just took the sackbut and made it bigger. Until pitch in first position was dropped to lower, so that you basically had a series of horns in different keys that could cover all of the notes you'd want to play, and you just move them around. I don't have an example for you because I am poor. So rather than filling the gap with one horn, you filled the gap with an ensemble of horns in different keys. The very first bass trombones, also sometimes called bass sackbuts, were commonly pitched in D, E, F, or G, since each of those pitches covers the majority of the gap that you would experience with this, and therefore throughout the whole sackbut section, you would cover all of the pitches you would need. Slides would also be so long on these horns that a lot of them were outfitted with like a handle mechanism, so you could reach the very bottom of the instruments because your arm physically wasn't long enough to get all the way down there. Eventually, we invented valves, and modern day brass instruments were born, like the baritone, trumpet, etc. And a lot of instrument manufacturers got the good idea to slap valves on a trombone. The first trombones with valves were not actually to extend the range of the horn. It was because having to throw your arm all the way out in sixth position is really hard, whereas if you have a trigger that puts your horn in the key of F, you don't have to reach and go down as far all the time. So if I'm doing like B flat to C, rather than having to do that, I could just go. Since manufacturers started making a trombone with an extra trigger, it had the unintended consequence of filling some of that gap because of how trombones are. Basically, putting it in sixth position means now I can get to seventh position here, and now I can get that hypothetical eighth, ninth, 10th, 11th position. If I do that same thing where I start at a B flat and work my way down, then I have almost the whole gap filled. You'll notice the only note that's missing there is the low B natural right before the pedal B flat. I bet you're wondering, why didn't they just make the extra addition a half step lower to hit that one note that we're missing? Well, the true answer is manufacturers did make trombones that have E and E flat attachments, but they didn't sell well. And the reason for that was because when you play trombone, you're exploiting, or you're at least used to exploiting what are called alternate positions. For example, without using any triggers, I have two positions to play B flat in. But with the trigger now, there's actually a third position I can play B flat in. Most people got used to learning the new alternate positions with their F attachment to make it easier to hit different notes or get different tuning or different voicing. They would have to relearn that whole process on a horn that had an E or an E flat attachment instead. So manufacturers, in response, started creating horns that had the F attachment and then a second littler rotary valve that you would manually turn in order to switch this attachment to be in E or E flat. That allowed you to have a fully chromatic instrument and keep your F attachment, because then you'd only have to crank it over to be an E or an E flat attachment if you're playing a piece where you really need it. So that way you wouldn't lose all of the hard work you did learning the F attachment while still getting the benefit of that lower note. This additional attachment is what we called the first dependent valve system. Called dependent because there's only one trigger that needs to be activated before you can get the second trigger. I do not have a horn with a dependent valve system, but here are some examples. Eventually, they decided to split it to make it so you can activate either valve independently, having this sort of trigger design where one valve is activated by each finger, so you have even more alternate positions. So now you get all of your alternate positions normally with the F attachment, with a G flat attachment, and with both attachments. So now doing that B flat again. And there are probably more, but I don't have the time to find all of the alternate positions. This gives you a ton of freedom in playing, which is why independent tends to be the preferred valve system for bass trombone players. Additionally, having that second valve, if we hadn't already expressed it, covers the whole chromatic range. So now I can go fully from B flat to B flat. Now that we have an instrument that is fully chromatic and can fully play its entire range without restriction, why don't we just use a tuba or euphonium anyway? So if you're not familiar with all of the different brass instruments, you may not know that trombones are actually historically very hard to clean in terms of being in tune and consistent. That's because the slide is very variable. There's infinite different places that I can put my horn, so that makes it a very difficult instrument to learn and master because of that. And each trombone, between these two, different notes are in tune in different positions. It's not entirely consistent. That is partially due to the fact that this is a student horn and this is a professional horn, but in general there's a lot of variability in trombones because of their slide. With euphoniums and tubas, we don't have that variability. And nowadays we've created euphoniums, tubas, and baritones that have 4, 5, or 6 valves and are fully chromatic because of that. Those are easier to clean because you're just pushing buttons, right? And any adjustments you need to make, you can make with your lips and your ear in order to be in tune rather than having to move your slide and such. We get stuck in this place of, why use this? Why do we see bass trombones in so many different genres of music and being used in so many different places? The main reason for that is because trombones have a characteristic sound. There's a bite, a sharpness, a distortion that trombones have that no other instrument does. The bass trombone sounds like a trombone and has all the characteristic tonal qualities of a trombone while being able to hit those low notes that a euphonium and tuba can also hit. While tubas and euphoniums tend to be preferred in orchestral settings, jazz loves the bass trombone. They love that tone, that in-your-face sound. A lot of rock musicians have also used a bass trombone, and a lot of pop songs that feature bands also use bass trombones over tubas or other instruments. Even drum corps have started incorporating bass trombones into their shows, though that's more so for features and to get a different kind of sound than tubas involved than to replace them entirely. There are some weirder instruments that are niche, at least in British influence and American influence bands, such as the cambasso, that also have that characteristic bite that you associate with a trombone and have valves, typically around 6. So again, why don't we use those instead of a trombone? Well, for one, not every manufacturer makes cambassos. They are more on the rare side. 2, you don't get to do the one thing that only a trombone can do, the glissando. No other instrument can do the glissando that trombones can do. If you want that gliss in your music, you need to use a trombone, and if you want to use a gliss for low notes such as B natural to whatever, you need a bass trombone to do it. The most skilled bass trombonists can actually gliss up the entire range of the horn while using their valves without you noticing. I am not that skilled, but I will do my best to demonstrate. That was so bad. The rest of this video is no longer going to be about facts and history. It's just going to be my personal preferences and why I like the bass trombone. So if you were just here for that facts and history section, you can go ahead and head out now if you'd like. If you want to stick around, I'd really appreciate it. If you like the video, throw it a like, and I'll yap a little bit more for anyone that wants to stick around. The main reason I'm talking to you about the bass trombone today is not just because I think it's cool. The bass trombone is actually my personal favorite instrument out of any instrument that exists in the world. The reason for that being because it's not just because it's one of the only instruments out there that is naturally a fully chromatic instrument, but also because I feel like with this horn and what it can do, the only limitation is you as a player. The bass trombone does not restrict me at all. It does not restrict my airflow. It does not restrict my tonal note qualities. It allows me to play any note that I want in the entire music ability, in tune and with good pitch. There is no limit to this. It is the most free instrument that there is. The only restriction is what I can play. This horn can do whatever I can do. This horn does whatever I am capable of doing. I'm not restricted by running out of notes to go down to. I'm not restricted by running out of notes to go up to. The only thing that is preventing this horn from playing notes is me. I think that's also why we see the bass trombone in so many different genres of music, because what this horn does cannot be replicated by any other instrument. This horn is freedom for musicians. You cannot replace the trombone and what it does. And I think history has shown that you cannot replace the bass trombone and what it does as well. I'm not saying it's perfect for every single style of music you're making or any single song or piece, but you can do a lot worse. That's the end of my rant about the bass trombone. I hope you learned something about this horn. I hope that it was entertaining, and I hope that you all have a great day. Thank you so much for watching.